Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. We are physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. At this time, Bonnie Gardner is going to be introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good morning, everybody. We're very fortunate to have Jim Cullen speaking with us today. He's speaking on populism in the era of Donald Trump. Jim Cullen is the editor of the Progressive Populist. He's going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of the populist movement in Texas and other rural states, and then the directions that the populist movement has taken over time and present challenges it's facing. Jim is a former editor of is a former Austin Capitol Bureau reporter for Hearst newspapers in Texas, and a former associate editor of the Texas Observer. He's too modest to tell you all these things himself, so I want to. He's a brilliant guy and a wonderful writer. For the past 24 years, he's been the founding editor of the Progressive Populist, which is a twice-monthly magazine of politics, economics, and general news for workers, small businesses, and family members and ranchers. It's actually the paper is actually a small family business, right? Okay. You can get a free sample. I'll give you their email. It's populist@usa.net, or go to the website at populist.com. Jim's commitment to serving social justice extends through many areas of his life, including his work with the Catholic charity St. Vincent de Paul. His newspaper reflects his almost encyclopedic knowledge of state and national politics. However, his serious sense of purpose is always leavened with his good humor and entertaining style. Let's give Jim a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, for that very warm introduction. And it's not like I won't brag on myself. It's often I just don't get the chance, so I do appreciate that. And I also will brag on my brother, Art Cullen, who's the managing editor of the Progressive Populist, who won the Pulitzer Prize this past year for his reporting on agricultural business in the Midwest. And he'll have a book coming out this fall on Viking Press, so look for that. We'll let you know if you subscribe to the Progressive Populist. And at the Progressive Populist, it grates on us every time Donald Trump is described as a populist. He talked a populist line during the presidential campaign with promises such as, under a Trump presidency, the American worker will finally have a president who will protect them and fight for them. But his campaign promises were entirely unbelievable, and his first year in office has proven the skepticism was warranted. Trump had a long record as a New York real estate developer and entrepreneur who had his clothing line made in China, imported Chinese steel to build his hotels, stiffed his subcontractors, making them sue him to get him paid, and resisted unions at his properties. He also used undocumented workers to work on many of his construction projects, particularly in New York. And he had a reputation as a liar, demonstrated by PolitiFact's running tally since 2011 that showed him telling the whole truth only about 4% of the time through November 2016. But Trump apparently attracted just enough suckers, possibly influenced by Russian hackers spreading fake news on the internet, combined with voter suppression in states such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, to surprise some of his closest aides, as well as his wife, and possibly even himself with his upset victory over Hillary Clinton. Now, Trump has been described as a populist by pundits who confuse populism with demagoguery. The People's Party, also known as the Populists, was an agrarian movement that grew up in the late 1800s from rural unrest at low agricultural prices and eastern control of banks and railroads upon which farmers depended. The Farmers' Alliance, formed in Lampasas in 1876, promoted collective economic action by farmers in the South and the Midwest, with calls to regulate and reform anti-competitive activities among merchants, railroads, and brokers. It joined with the Knights of Labor from 1889 to 1892 to form the People's Party that grew up into a major movement in left-wing politics in the 1890s. In 1892, the party's platform, commonly known as the Omaha Platform, called for the abolition of national banks, a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, civil service reform, a working day of 8 hours, and government regulation of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones. In the 1892 presidential election, James B. Weaver of Iowa received 1,027,000 votes, or 8.5% of the total, to finish third. Weaver carried 4 states, Colorado, Kansas, Idaho, and Nevada, and received electoral votes from Oregon and North Dakota as well. The Populists also made an attempt to bring women and blacks into the coalition, noting that black and white farmers had the same economic interests. Women, of course, didn't have the vote at that time, but they were involved in policy discussions in developing the agenda. The Populists had some success in fusion with Democrats outside the South, and in southern states like Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, they worked with Republicans, including large numbers of black voters. In the elections of 1894, a coalition of populists and Republicans swept state and local offices in North Carolina, and the coalition would go on to elect a Republican governor in 1896. But by then, the Democratic Party had taken up many of the People's Party causes, and the populists began to fade from national prominence. In that year's presidential election, the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan, who drew much of the populist vote with his focus on the free silver issue, which was designed to increase the money supply to ease debt on farmers as a solution to the economic depression and the maldistribution of power. Bryan swept the old populist strongholds in the Midwest and South and added the Silverite states in the West, but he did poorly in the industrial heartland. He lost to Republican William McKinley by a margin of 600,000 votes and lost again in a rematch in 1900 by a larger margin. In North Carolina, the state Democratic Party establishment orchestrated a brutal white supremacy election campaign to defeat the North Carolina populists and Republicans in 1898. The fusionist revolt in North Carolina collapsed, and white Democrats returned to power. In North Carolina and throughout the South, segregation laws were strengthened to prevent any future alliances between poor whites and blacks, and that was the time when the Jim Crow laws really came into force. Some of them were already existing, but they really put more teeth into them and began to institute things like grandfather clauses to keep black voters from voting. But much of the populist legislative agenda was accomplished in later years by the progressives under Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s. And there was a strong populist imprint, I might add, in Texas, where Governor James Hogg grew up in the populist movement, and populists had played a large part in creating the Railroad Commission in 1892, I believe it was, which at that time really did control the railroads. And they also prohibited chain banks in Texas. If some of you may recall that we didn't used to allow national banks to have chains in Texas until the Ronald Reagan, I believe, the comptroller decreed that we must allow national banks to locate in Texas. And that was the beginning of the end for a lot of community banks around the state. Nowadays, there's not much populist in lying Donnie Trump, who conned his way into the White House by promising to fight for working people and protect Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. But after his inauguration, he installed administrators whose job has been to dismantle every worker or consumer-friendly regulation that President Barack Obama implemented. Trump also installed a half dozen current and former executives of Goldman Sachs, the Wall Street investment brokerage, to deliver the goods to the plutocrats as usual. Then, as the year was coming to a close, with the great misleader's unpopularity stuck in the 30s and dragging congressional Republicans down with him, the window of opportunity to pass major legislation was closing. Wealthy donors threatened to withhold money from their dependent Republicans if the GOP didn't furnish a massive tax break as a return on their investment. Republicans drafted a bill that would cut government services that working families depend upon to pay for huge tax giveaways to billionaires and corporations in the legislative equivalent of a smash and grab robbery. And the AFL-CIO Labor Federation noted that the tax bill would rig tax rules in favor of big banks, hedge funds, and Wall Street financial firms. The richest 1% of households would receive 83% of tax cuts, and the richest 0.1% would get an average tax cut of more than $148,000 each. The tax bill is full of complex tax gimmicks that would encourage tax dodging by the investor class while enriching lawyers and accountants, and the Senate passed it on a 51-48 party line vote December 19th. The House then finally passed the bill 224-201 December 20th to make a great Christmas gift to your friendly neighborhood billionaire. Republicans signaled that they plan to use the deficit from the tax boondoggle as an excuse to cut Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, giving another lie to Trump's assurances that he would protect the safety net. The Republican budget already signed by Trump would cut Medicaid and Medicare by $1.5 trillion, the same price tag as the tax bill, and Republicans are proposing a $492 million cut in the Social Security Administration, reducing the agency's staff so seniors will have a harder time getting access to benefits. Republicans promised their plan would help the middle class with tax relief for businesses that will stimulate economic growth and higher wages. Classic supply-side economic hogwash, which failed under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, George W. Bush in the early 2000s, and in Kansas under Governor Sam Brownback from 2012 until mid-2017, when Republican legislators finally joined Democrats to restore the taxes over Brownback's veto. The entire congressional delegation still voted for the new tax scam, however. Although Republicans claimed the tax scam would cut taxes for working families, at least in the first few years of implementation, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office sees tax increases for millions of working people, as the average household making less than $75,000 would pay more in taxes by the year 2027. In all, 70 million households earning less than $100,000 eventually would pay more under the new law. And any temporary increase in take-home pay from the tax cuts likely will be offset with increases in health care costs, as the tax bill repealed parts of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which means health care premiums will rise by 10% or more. The CBO estimated 13 million people would lose health insurance, and health experts say thousands of Americans could die every year from loss of coverage. The American public has caught on to this scam. A CNN poll released December 19th found only 33% of Americans favor the GOP tax bill, while 55% oppose it, making this the most unpopular bill in 30 years. A Gallup poll released January 8th showed Trump's job approval stuck at 37%, while 58% disapproved. On generic congressional races, Democrats were leading Republicans by a substantial margin going into this month. Now, the corporate press, whose owners will rake in big bucks from the tax cuts, has rated this a great victory at last for Trump and his Republican Congress, and that might improve GOP popularity in months to come. But this plutocratic tax bill puts a target on the back of every Republican member of the House and the Senate who have enabled Lying Donnie, as well as his Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. It makes it imperative that Democrats regain control of Congress in 2018 so they can block more bad things from happening, including confirmation of the teabagger lawyers Trump is putting forward for lifetime appointments to judgeships. GOP committee heads also are helping Trump obstruct justice in the probe of Russian interference in the 2016 election. And the best hope for dreamers, the estimated 800,000 immigrants who were brought into this country as children, to get the immigration agents off their backs and let them stay in this country, is if they help Democrats take over the House and Senate and demonstrate to President Trump and the grand oligarch party that there is a price to be paid for pursuing racist policies. It probably will take until 2021, after Democrats regain control of the White House, as well as, we hope, the House and Senate, that Democrats can repeal this dreadful tax bill, if necessary by the same reconciliation process by which it was enacted. And Democrats may profit from the lesson on how to pass bills without a 60-vote supermajority in the Senate. Among other things, expansion of Medicare to cover everybody now appears to be within reach with a simple majority. But it will require Democrats to adopt real populist solutions to win back those millions of white working-class voters who were swindled by Donald Trump. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to. Yes.
Okay, I'll bring you the microphone if you'll stand up and introduce yourself. Did you have a question? If you'll stand up.
Yeah, my name's Ted Gertzel. I'm from Ohio, really. I was hoping you'd say more specifically about Texas, since I'm pretty much familiar with the national scene. But
yeah, well, in Texas, as I said, there's a strong tradition of populism going back to the Farmers Alliance and Jim Hogg and the original populist reforms in the 1890s. And that persisted through the 1990s, when I don't know how long you've been here, but they finally adopted, there remained a strong suspicion of bankers up to that time, as long as the Democrats remained control of the legislature. And when they finally allowed second mortgages, they put in some strong protections against how much you could borrow against your home, so you wouldn't get in the kind of trouble that people were getting into in other parts of the country. And that's one of the reasons that during the mortgage meltdown in 2007 and 2008, it didn't strike Texas as hard as it did in a lot of other parts of the country. However, of course, now they came back last year with a constitutional amendment to make it a little easier to get a second mortgage, and with Republicans in charge of the government, we've seen a lot of those populist traditions kind of fray away. Now, they will talk about themselves as populists, but they, like I said, that's the kind of populism that, right-wing populism is basically fascism. They want to make it appear that they're working on behalf of working people, but they haven't done a thing for working people since they've gotten in control of, say, government. It used to be that Texans were proud that if you worked your way up, and if you were able to get admitted into a Texas university, you could pay your tuition based on if you worked a part-time job in the summer. Nowadays, I think it costs more than $25,000 a year to go to the University of Texas. It used to be, I think when Rick Perry went to the Texas A&M, it was $150 a year in tuition at Texas A&M. And the reason is, in those days, Texas paid 85% of the cost of higher education. Today, it's, I think, 15% Texas pays. So students pay 85% of the cost of their education, and Republicans think that's a good thing. Ronald Reagan was the one who instigated that, because in California they had free tuition, and these college students would come out and protest whatever he was doing, and he'd say, well, these students obviously have too much time on their hands. They need to get to work. So when he did away with, he started charging tuition in California, and when he became president, he and Phil Gramm from Texas played a large part in doing away with federal grants for middle-class students, because here again, Phil Gramm had complained that people would go to law school, and after they get out of law school, if they didn't have a large debt, they'd be able to join a public interest law firm like Texas Rural Legal Aid and start suing the state of Texas. And he said he didn't like that, so he wanted tuition to increase, and they have accomplished that. They also made Pell Grants so that basically you have to be a low-income person. Middle-class people don't qualify for it anymore. So then it's a lot easier to cut Pell Grant appropriations, because nobody you know is hurt by it. They were hurt 20 years ago by it, but they got over it. So, and I don't understand why Texans put up with that, particularly Texans who have kids, who now have a mortgage-sized loan that their kids and or they have to pay for. The same thing has happened when the Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act, allowing states to let their low-income working people get health care from Medicaid. Texas Republicans refused to hear about it. They wouldn't expand Medicaid to cover working Texans that were under the poverty level. And if you work for minimum wage, you are under the poverty level. So, and health experts from the Harvard University Medical School and I think it was the City University of New York estimated that I think it was 1,500 Texans would die every year because of the lack of medical attention. And Republicans call themselves the pro-life party. I don't, I'd call a word for it that I don't think I should say in this sanctuary, but they've been wading in it and for 20 to 30 years. If you can name something that the Republican Party has done for working Texans, I'd like to hear about it. Yeah, Ken? Oh.
I think I'm next.
Okay, well, he's number three then.
Okay, Douglas Bauer. One of the iconic features of Trump's campaign were these red hats made in China with the letters MAGA on them, which is Make America Great Again. And Trump never defined when America was great. I was wondering if you could put your opinions on what he's talking about there.
Well, yeah, I think I can only surmise that it was when he was growing up as a young lad, and when his dad was regaling him with tales of his days marching with the Ku Klux Klan in New York in the 20s. You know, and when they refused to rent places to Latinos or African Americans in their apartment complexes. So, I mean, it must have looked good to him, particularly when he was able to go to a military school, because after the public schools had had enough of his bullying tactics. So he hasn't really filled in what specific time he's talking about, but I think you can probably surmise back before, well.
I'm Ken Cook. My question is, Jim, how do you assess the Democratic chances going forward, given the Citizens United unlimited amount of spending that the opposition Republican Party seems to be able to come up with, and then also the absence of a proper gerrymandering or a properly districting for voting districts, and the low voter turnout? Seems like we're battling three things to get the Democratic majority you're talking about.
Well, yeah, and the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision basically, as Tom Hartman says on his radio show, ruled that people can buy their own politicians if they have the money. And unfortunately that is true. That's been manifestly confirmed in this tax scam that they passed in December. There was no reason to pass that bill. It blows a $1.5 trillion hole in the budget, but their donors demanded. They said, "We've been giving you money for years. You finally got control of the White House and the Congress. By God, you will give us a tax return on our investment." And they got it. So at some point, voters have to realize that they've been swindled. And I know people say we've lost our democracy. Well, we haven't lost our democracy. We've given it away. We're resigned to it. I mean, the Republicans literally are trying to prevent us from voting. They have done a pretty good job, and that's one of the reasons they won in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, because in Milwaukee, they put the malfunctioning machines in the black voter precincts. The same thing happened in Detroit and Flint, Michigan. There were many ballots that where people unaccountably had voted for every office except for president, and the Republican officials in Michigan refused to allow a recount of those ballots. Republican legislators admitted when they implemented these voter identification laws around the country that they were designed to elect more Republicans. A legislator in Pennsylvania said that. Same thing happened in Wisconsin. In an unguarded moment, they occasionally commit the gaffe of telling the truth. They were bragging about how they fixed the elections. So really, the Republicans, the Russians may have been involved in hacking and helping to confuse voters, but the Republicans literally have fixed elections, and we need to demand that until the Republicans can assure us that they can keep the Russians out of our election computers, that we need to return to paper ballots or some secure method of casting a vote. But we also need to make it clear that anybody who gets millions of dollars from the Koch brothers and their network and the NRA and other big business appendages, we need to view them with justifiable suspicion. Now, at least according to recent polls, there is a chance that Democrats can take back the House and the Senate, but it will require that Democrats vote we can't afford to take the election day off. We can't afford to get our pants in a twist because we don't agree with everything the Democrats do. Sometimes it is necessary to vote for the lesser of two evils. if you don't want the greater of two evils to persist. So, but some demographers say it could require Democrats to carry the congressional vote by 5 to 8% to actually get a majority in the House, just to overcome the biases of gerrymandering. That's something we need to consider. But that is a product of progressive voters who were upset that the Affordable Care Act didn't have a single payer in it, or it wasn't Medicare for all, and so they said, well, we're not going to support the Democrats in the 2010 elections. We'll just take the day off. Well, the Republicans worked that day, gotten out the vote. They took over legislatures. They passed, terrible redistricting bills, gerrymandered redistricting bills, and now they're trying to call a constitutional convention to redraw the Constitution to fit the biases of the Koch brothers and these other billionaires. And they're only a few states away from calling that constitutional convention. And any progressive that thinks that it would be a good thing for us to call a constitutional amendment convention needs to consider how successful we have been at getting our voices heard on the commercial TV and broadcasting, particularly now that the FCC under Donald Trump is moving to limit our access to the internet through the repeal of net neutrality. They're pretty good, because people are pissed off. That's one thing. We at least have a chance, so let's not drop the ball.
Thanks for being here today. My name is Luther Elmore, and my question involves our current action. That is, it seems to me that there are pockets of progressivism popping up, such as here in the state of Texas, such as in Denton, and here in Austin, with some progressive reforms that are addressing the needs and concerns and workers' rights and environmental issues. However, as you well know, just this past week, the City of Austin the City Council passed a bill requiring mandatory sick leave for workers in the City of Austin. At the same time, we've already had a Republican state representative saying that he will introduce a bill to see that no city can do such as that. So how do we get people to see the hypocrisy of what the Republicans say and what they do, and back away from these things and potentially allow local jurisdictions, which they claim to support, to bring about some of these progressive changes?
Well, you can get them to subscribe to the Progressive Populist, but other than that, it seems pretty obvious to me that there's rank hypocrisy. These people will claim to support local control of government until the local government tries to do something they don't agree with. Then they'll supersede it at the legislature or Congress. They're also trying to pass a bill to make it that every state has to recognize any other state's concealed carry permits. And it just boggles the mind that the Republican Party is entirely beholden to the NRA, which now the FBI is investigating whether they laundered money for Russian oligarchs on behalf of the Trump campaign. So I know a lot of leftists, particularly older leftists, may recoil at trying to tie somebody to the Russians and guilt by association, but it's a little fun to call the Republicans fellow travelers. So have yourself some payback.
Hi, Julie Pache. Thanks for joining us today. So this is a pretty depressing time right now. What are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that you would recommend people do beyond getting out to vote, because we'll all do that, but after that, what would you suggest?
Well, get registered to vote. Make sure you are registered to vote, and your family and neighbors, because the Republicans are trying to challenge people's registration when they think they might vote Democratic. You know, get the word out the best way you can, and you know, get people pissed off, and make sure, you know, just don't get worn down. You know, it's good to have people motivated, but if they feel like there's no hope, that's when they fall down. And that's one thing the Republicans have tried to do, is say there is no hope. They ridicule liberals. They are trained to downplay any facts with which they do not agree. You know, Trump himself, popularized calling it everything that he doesn't agree with fake news. And we have to demand that radio and TV tell it like it is. Even here in Austin, the liberal center of Texas, we don't have any liberal talk shows like Tom Hartman. I have to listen to him over the internet until the FCC cuts him off. You know, Jim Hightower used to have a talk show until they cut him off right about the time that I started the Populist 24 years ago. That Jim Hightower can't do a radio show in Austin, Texas, that's a disgrace. They did away with the fairness doctrine, and that enabled the billionaires who own radio stations to cut liberals off the air and put up people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity. And so it's hard to get our side of the story out, but it's not impossible, and we just have to work harder.
So to piggyback on Julie's question, what can give us hope? Because you know, I need hope every day, and what are some hopeful things that we can think about? Well, remember that Trump only won by about less than 70,000 votes total in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and those votes, frankly, were that margin is suspicious. You know, we have good people, and it isn't that long ago that Barack Obama was reelected president and served 2 terms, and I didn't agree with everything he did. I wish he was more of a socialist that Republicans claimed he was. But the good news is that a lot of younger people are saying, well, if that's socialism, I'm all for it. And so I think Democrats would be well served if they adopted a more populist and even possibly socialist platform. One of the problems I think that Bernie Sanders made when he first started running for president was he kept talking about how would like the United States to be more like Denmark or Norway, when he could have just said, I would like us to reestablish the New Deal, which a lot of people in the United States are still familiar with, despite Republican attempts to tear it down. There is a strong foundation of progressive, populist, and socialist programs in the United States. That's what the biggest socialist program in the United States is the U.S. military, and the Veterans Administration offers quality medical care if we fund it. And the Republicans talk about all the problems the complaints they've heard about the VA service. Well, yeah, they've been cutting the budget for 10 years. Of course they're having problems. And the same way with Social Security. I talked about they're cutting the Social Security administrative budget, so they're having cutbacks. I don't know if you've gone to a Social Security office. I had to get a new card last year, and it wasn't a particular problem, but who knows what it's going to be like next year, or if you have to
get any changes in qualifying for Medicare. Paul Ryan has a plan to extend the Medicare retirement age past the current 65. And he says, we've got to because we've spent the money. Well, yeah, they spent the money on tax cuts to these billionaires. That is not conservative. That's just being a spendthrift. People call us tax and spend liberals. I think that's that's a better thing to be than a borrow and spend Republican. And that's what they've done.
I'm Alice Harris. What about it is about time to get rid of the Electoral College, because Trump did not win the election. He only got it through the Electoral College.
Yeah, and Hillary's the people's choice. Yeah, sure.
Because we are not back in the frontier time. We actually have innovation here, and so we don't need the Electoral College anymore. So when are we going to get rid of that?
Well, yeah, sure. I know, and if the reverse had happened and Trump had somehow won a majority vote of the people but lost in the Electoral College, the Republicans wouldn't stand for it. There'd be riots in the street, but we put up with it. The problem is that the smaller states would not ratify an amendment to do away with the Electoral College, because that is a major voice for them.
Doesn't it eliminate, we're not listening to the voters, we're listening to, it just doesn't seem like my vote counts, because the Electoral College, they have the say, I don't have a say.
Well, the idea behind it is that you have to go to Iowa and ask them for a vote, or Idaho, or Vermont, that you can't just win with huge majorities in California and Texas and New York. You have to go to each state and win in each state to have an appeal. Now, as a practical matter, that doesn't hold as much water as it used to, but that's the argument that they would make, that your vote actually counts more because people have to come to Texas to campaign.
Do you see any green shoots in terms of white working class people becoming disaffected with Trump and sort of segueing into something related? Are there any signs that we may see reemergence of unions?
Well, I think I have mixed emotions because, first of all, I don't believe a lot of those white working class people voted for economic reasons. I think a lot of it had to do with they just didn't like Hillary, and they don't like a lot of the things that have improved for blacks and Latinos and gays during the Obama administration. I think there was a lot of backlash against that. People who did vote for economic reasons, I think, now regret it. The unions never believed Trump, and Trump has made it more difficult for unions to organize. One of the things he did was withdraw the regulation that Obama's Labor Department had instituted to lower the threshold for, or increase the threshold for overtime pay. You know, you used to be, I think it used to be something like 30,000. If you made more than 30,000, you could be considered, anybody could be considered a manager and not eligible for a time and a half overtime. The Obama administration, I think, was increasing that to 70,000 or so, which would be a major improvement for working class people. And the Trump administration just did away with it. They also, his appointees to the National Labor Relations Board are big business lackeys. The new appointee to the Department of Health and Human Services is a pharmaceutical exec. The person I think responsible for mining safety is a former mine lobbyist. You know, it's just almost crazy to think that he campaigned on as a champion of the working people and then totally flipped in his policies once he became president. But the people who really believe in him, no matter what he does, they say, well, give him a chance. I think he said, I personally wasn't willing to give him a chance in the first place, but he has proved himself to be a louse.
Of course, I mentioned I'm from Ohio, and we are a battleground state, but it seems like you're talking, all your hope is not in Texas. You're talking about national things and national changes, and I know it's like West Virginia across the river for me. I think that's hopeless too, but I take it you don't see any hope of, say, Texas changing and voting for a Democratic president or any, you're counting on those of us in the rest of the country to reverse this.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, Texas is a hard slog, but there are a lot of people who have moved into Texas in the last 20 years, and all the cities in Texas are now Democratic. Dallas, Harris County has become a pretty solid Democratic stronghold. Of course, San Antonio, El Paso, the Valley. But the rural areas have switched almost overnight, and I think one of the reasons that behind that was the Democrats passing the assault weapons ban in 1994. And, you know, a lot of Democratic congressmen lost in the 94 election because of that, including Jack Brooks in Beaumont, who had been a congressman for 50 years and done a lot of great things for his district, but the gun owners just would not forgive him for passing the assault weapons ban, even though nobody needs an assault weapon. It's a terrible, no honest person outside of the military or the police needs an assault weapon. It's no good for defending your home. Bullets will go through a wall, and you're much better with a German Shepherd than to have an assault weapon in your house. But ever since then, the Republicans have been saying that literally the NRA baselessly kept accusing Barack Obama of wanting to come after your guns. And as he had repeatedly said, I haven't seized anybody's guns. We just want to put some common sense controls on them. But right now, Beto O'Rourke seems to be challenging Ted Cruz enough so that Ted Cruz had to curtail his normal fiscal conservative talk and vote for the continuing resolution to keep the government open, because it included $90 billion for hurricane relief and disaster relief for Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and also California. Trump probably included California reluctantly since they voted against him. But I do think there is hope, but we just need to work hard and hope that our Mexican-American friends can hold a grudge, as well as my Irish-American relatives, because Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and John Cornyn and the Republican delegation have consistently vilified these Latino immigrants who got here the only way they could. You can say they should have followed the law. Well, there is no law that would protect that would let them into the United States in any practical manner. And we can't afford to deport them. People in Houston can't find construction crews to help them rebuild their homes because the ICE is deporting Latinos on site. So we should be able to use our head, but Ted Cruz opposed every compromise bill to try to give just the dreamers, the people who were brought in as kids, who had no role in deciding to come to the United States, but grew up here and have gone to school, in many cases have gotten jobs or joined the military, and now Donald Trump wants to deport them because, as he said, in what he thought were private comments, he had had enough of these immigrants from S-hole countries and wanted more immigrants from places like Norway. And I've got news for him: Norwegians aren't interested in coming to the United States anymore.
Oh, Jim Bryce, appreciate your covering these topics. There is room for hope in that there are good issues of overcoming the Electoral College, and we have other things happening too, and that is with respect to guns. Now finally people are really beginning to wake up. Plus Donald Trump himself is so abrasive. What do you see for these, first off, negative things actually being flipped to get many more people supporting the progressive cause?
Well, the thing that could really kill the Republicans is if women flipped on him. And God knows he's done enough to alienate women. But what was it, 58% of white women voted for him in the election? Go figure. I don't understand it, but you know, there are certain things that run deep. And if Latinos can be encouraged to get out to vote, that's the great hope for Texas Democrats. We've been waiting for that Latino wave to rise for years, and there again, if Donald Trump hasn't done enough to motivate them to get out to vote, I don't know what will. So there are reasons for hope, and unfortunately for a lot of us who would like to think well of others, sometimes a grudge is a better reason for getting people out to vote than love. But whichever way gets them to the polls works for me.
Yeah, in your opening remarks, you talked a little bit about the Populist Party and its use of women leaders, and one of those, I'm sure as you well know, was Mary Lease, who famously said that farmers ought to raise less corn and more hell. And so what is the one area and which we should raise more hell? What should we focus on to try to get some relief for the 99%?
Well, this tax bill ought to do the trick. I don't know if you have seen any raise in your paychecks. I doubt that many people have noticed it. But the thing is, the election will probably, well, it will occur before a lot of people realize that they've been had on this tax bill. They won't find that out till they get their returns in 2019, and when the Republicans are being sworn in and sworn at. But you know, we've just got to pay attention to the damage that they've done. We've got what appears to be a clear road for people who are paying attention. It's like it's not that difficult to get to Kerrville, but you do have to consult a map, and we do need to consult what's been going on to get to where we want to go. And part of that involves reading the Progressive Populist, I must say. And there are other fine publications like the Texas Observer and the Austin Chronicle. Yeah, you can find some facts in there. Hightower Lowdown. We run his columns in the Populist, but we encourage the Lowdown too.
We do have time for about one more question.
Back to the recent tax cuts. My impression, it seems like it's very heavily front-end loaded, and that worries me because for some people there are going to be small benefits this year, and it may be enough to get the Republicans through the midterm. I was wondering if you could comment if my impression is correct.
Well, yeah, you may have heard that there was some school teacher who said, wow, $1.50 a week, that'll be enough to cover my Costco membership. And apparently Paul Ryan didn't realize that there may have been some sarcasm in that comment. But yeah, there is a lot of front loading and people, but there again, I just don't think a lot of people are seeing that much of an improvement in their paycheck, and Democrats need to pound on that. This was the major thing Trump was going to do for you. Well, how do you feel now with your $1.50 a week? And also that school teacher lost the deductibility of money that she pays for school supplies, and a lot of small business owners are going to find out that tax bill giveth, but it taketh away mainly from them, particularly independent contractors who may find that a lot of their business expenses are no longer deductible. I asked my accountant about it, and she said, I'm still trying to figure it out. And she said, but don't feel bad, the IRS is still trying to figure it out. They've got hundreds of pages of documents, some probably still with scribbles in the margin, and trying to figure out what it was that Congress did to them.
All right, I think that sums up everything. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. If you'd like to come up and ask him a few more questions after we go off the air, I'm sure you'll be willing to stick around for a little bit longer afterward. Thank you.